There it is. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Chema Jimenez, and I will be moderating today's session, which will be entitled Jungian and Archetypal Perspectives on BDSM, presented by Douglas Thomas. Douglas Thomas, PhD, LCSW, has a Jungian-based psychotherapy practice in Pasadena, California, specializing in LGBTQ+ issues, alternative sexualities, and dream therapy. He teaches as adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California, and he has presented papers at international Jungian conferences. His essays have appeared in the International Journal of Jungian Studies and the Jungian Journal of Scholarly Studies. His latest book, The Deep Psychology of BDSM and Kink, Jungian and Archetypal Perspectives on the Soul's Transgressive Necessities, was published by Routledge in September of 2023. And the audiobook came out in August of this year. And if you would like more information, you can visit his website, which is drdouglasthomas.com. Going to turn over the microphone to Douglas, who will be presenting. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Chema. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here and share this material with you today. I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint at this point. I'll make sure everybody can see that okay. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
I want to begin by acknowledging that the topic of this presentation involves some extreme sexual situations that often play at the edge of what is emotionally and physically tolerable. And these situations entertain some of the darker aspects of the human psyche, potentially disturbing aspects. The presentation is going to include some descriptions and some images that you might find strangely attractive or troubling, or perhaps both. The thesis that I'm proposing is that BDSM and kink have become a way to bring soul into our hyper-rational, hyper-materialistic world. And I invite you to sit with your reactions, deepen into them, and see if you can better understand them. However, I also want to be clear it's not my intention to distress or offend anybody. And if you need to take care of yourselves by taking some space during the presentation, I hope you won't hesitate to do that. As the author of The Deep Psychology of BDSM and Kink, which is the source for most of the material presented today, I do have a financial interest in sales of the book. You might be wondering why I wrote this book. I have experience as a psychotherapist and as an educator and author, and I'm also familiar with the world of BDSM. For some time, I've been thinking about the challenges that BDSM practitioners face when they're looking for a kink-affirming therapist. And I've also been intrigued by how Jungian psychology and the archetypal psychology of James Hillman are well suited for exploring the psychological value of BDSM and kink. Our Jungian world has done little to apply the richness of its psychology to this topic. So I wrote this book in the hopes that folks into BDSM will find a new psychological language to better understand why the things that they do are so powerful and deeply pleasurable, and also to encourage a deeper psychological curiosity on the part of Jungian-based psychotherapists to better serve kinky clients. This presentation has 6 objectives today. I want to offer a clear definition of what is meant by BDSM and kink, provide a brief overview of how BDSM became a social movement, apply some relevant concepts from Jungian and archetypal psychology, review the major themes from the book, discuss the complexity of suffering and degradation and evil as archetypal soul images that are present in BDSM activities, and engage with all of you in 2 breakout discussions to synthesize the concepts that are being presented. So first, a few definitions. As is true of any cultural movement, the world of BDSM and its descriptive language is constantly updating and changing. However, BDSM most commonly refers to bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. The term describes some combination of eroticism, sexual expression, and structured authority imbalance. Examples include the dominant-submissive relationship, and in its most extreme form, the modern consensual master-slave relationship. Participation in BDSM ranges from people who seek occasional pleasure and excitement to those who find a profound sense of identity, meaning, and intimacy in the relational dynamics. Kink is a loosely defined umbrella term for a range of fetish-based interests and activities. BDSM and kink have attracted people of all sexual and gender orientations, all races, and all socioeconomic levels. We have a growing body of research that's determined there's nothing inherently pathological about the enjoyment of BDSM and kink, and research data does not indicate that pleasure from giving or receiving pain or participating in authority imbalanced relationships is the result from early experiences of trauma and abuse. It's estimated that somewhere between 11 to 45% of the population has experimented at least once with BDSM and kink. And central to any definition is the concept of consent. The BDSM community has developed a thorough process of negotiation and mutual consent, which includes establishing a means to withdraw consent at any time during play. These elements of negotiation and consent are what distinguish BDSM and kink from abuse and sociopathy. The historical evidence suggests that the use of pain, suffering, degradation, and humiliation have been part of potentially pleasurable experiences throughout history and across cultures. Sometimes the practice has been a conduit to ecstatic experience in a spiritual or religious context. For example, in the excavated ruins of Pompeii, there's a fresco in the Villa of Mysteries depicting an initiate being scourged with the staff of Dionysus. In the 1700s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously wrote in his Confessions about the erotic pleasure he experienced as a young boy when his female caretaker would spank him. And by the end of the same century, the scandalous fictions of the Marquis de Sade made it clear that Rousseau was not the only person on the European continent experiencing erotic pleasure through pain and humiliation. One of the best documented instances of an early negotiated consensual master-slave relationship occurred in Victorian England between Arthur Munby and Hannah Colwick. The Austrian author Leopold von Sacher-Masoch published his novella Venus in Furs in 1870, and the semi-autobiographical relationship between the protagonist and his erotically dominant partner became the source material for Richard von Krafft-Ebing coining the term masochism in his Encyclopedia of Sexual Disorders, Psychopathia Sexualis. From that point on until just recently, sadism and masochism were considered categorically as sexual perversions by the mental health profession. In the United States, we know that sadomasochism was a part of gay culture from at least the 1930s. The beginning of the modern BDSM movement is largely regarded as emanating from the impact of World War II's end. For soldiers who experienced same-sex attractions, The intense experiences of combat and the intimate bonds with other men left them disinclined to return to the farms and small-town lives that they had called home before the war. Many settled in the major urban centers of the US, and others sought the freedom of a more itinerant lifestyle with other men through gay motorcycle clubs. The modern mythology is that they lived as a fringe community, and they enjoyed their status as sexual outlaws, adopting a regimented code of conduct and hierarchical relationships as a holdover from military culture. Gay leather culture evolved from motorcycle culture, and gay leather bars emerged in the 50s and 60s as part of the scene. With a bit of Dionysian panache, the first club, established in 1954 in Los Angeles, was called the Satyrs, and its members appear in this photograph. Over this same period, heterosexual aficionados of BDSM were forming their own network of relationships through specialty publications and classified ads. In the 1970s, we saw a dramatic increase in the development of supportive organizations, such as the Eulenspiegel Society in New York City and the Janus Society in San Francisco. Drummer Magazine was the preeminent publication for the gay leather community, featuring pictorials and works of erotic fiction and advice columns that both mirrored and codified the cultural paradigms of the readership that it served. Samoa was the first all-female BDSM organization, and it played a central role in what came to be known as the feminist sex wars. Some feminist writers, such as Susan Sontag and Adrienne Rich, critiqued the practice of sadomasochism as a toxic expression of Western culture's patriarchal beliefs. They said that SM was inherently misogynistic. Members of Samoa published rebuttals that argued women into same-sex SM practices were asserting their power by claiming their right to sexual pleasure in negotiated, co-created experiences with other women. 1979 saw the first international Mr. Leather contest in Chicago, which remains to this day the premier leather event in the US, if not the world, promoting the ideal of leather identity as a competitive pageant. During the worst years of the AIDS pandemic in the 80s and 90s, BDSM and leather organizations now included an increased commitment to community service and advocacy as part of their mission. Perhaps the most influential group was gay male SM activists established in 1980. A divide developed in the BDSM community between the push for greater recognition and acceptance by the larger society and the pull to preserve the fringe status of sexual outlaw. With an increased emphasis on education and training, the term safe, sane, and consensual was widely adopted to emphasize the commitment to personal responsibility, empowerment, and well-being. The 1987 March on Washington for LGBTQ rights was the first time that a BDSM contingent was allowed to join other queer groups at a national event. Over the past 30 years, the biggest impact on the evolution of BDSM and kink culture has come from the internet. Kinksters no longer rely on small community organizations or special interest publications, and the development of a larger online community has led to the expansion of fetish and kink interests and identities. FetLife, the premier online site for BDSM practitioners, now has close to 9 million users worldwide. The runaway success of E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey franchise introduced the general public to kink and BDSM, and it signaled a watershed moment in social attitudes toward the activities as something other than perversion. At the same time, however, the books egregiously misrepresent the community's emphasis on consent and negotiation as part of a healthy relationship. Let's turn now to a consideration of how a few Jungian concepts can be applied to BDSM and kink. I'm going to address the relevance of themes from Jung's Red Book and the concepts of individuation, the shadow, and the psychoid. In the Red Book, Jung encapsulated a sentiment that he expressed throughout his career. I must catch up with a piece of the Middle Ages inside myself, he wrote. Jung regarded the Middle Ages as the historical period that gave rise to some of the more extreme, one-sided psychological attitudes that trouble our modern lives. His attention to the medieval psyche is evident in his presentation of the Red Book as an illuminated manuscript, his fascination with alchemy, and his construction of the tower at Bollingen, just to give 3 examples. Similar to BDSM, the Red Book draws repeatedly on themes and images of suffering, torture, domination, submission, and enslavement. Let's see, I guess we have to admit somebody so that I can advance the...
I already did it.
Okay, thanks. So what this suggests to me is that the activities and relationships of BDSM, similar to these themes in the Red Book, are emanating from significant archetypal structures in the deep psyche. In BDSM, the medieval spirit is also prevalent. Play spaces are commonly referred to as dungeons. Many BDSM scenes are constructed around the fantasy of torture with the use of chains, floggers, and whips, and the iconic executioner's hood and St. Andrew's cross, which all reflect our collective fantasies of medieval life. What concerned Jung regarding these brutal aspects of our medieval ancestors was that the historical progression of human reason drove their inhumanity into our unconscious. In the Red Book, Jung valorizes degradation, humiliation, and suffering as necessary and valuable experiences in the individuation process, experiences which compensate for the one-sided privileging of reason and moral virtue encouraged by the conscious collective attitude. Perhaps beyond consciousness, modern kinksters are catching up with an archetypal piece of the Middle Ages within themselves. I want to pause and just take a moment to reflect on this photograph. The subversive and countercultural nature of BDSM and kink make the concept of individuation particularly relevant. Mainstream collective values, which establish our standards of so-called normal and healthy sexuality, form conventions that BDSM, by its very nature, transgresses. It is the inner imperative of the individuation process that guides kinksters toward the activities and relational dynamics that they find so profoundly fulfilling. One feels an inner necessity to follow the urges of unconventional and sometimes culturally forbidden fantasy images. The highly codified roles of BDSM can support the individuation process because they embody the archetypal fantasy images that exist autonomously from ego consciousness. That is another way to understand what's happening in this photograph. Archetypal figures are shaping every element of the scene that's being enacted. Archetypal forces emerge from the depths and seize us, captivate us, and have the potential to guide us along the path of individuation. Jungian psychology can also help BDSM practitioners navigate the risks of over-identification with such compelling archetypal figures through learning the skill of differentiation. The concept of the shadow is also very relevant. Often, practitioners experience the thrill of transgressing social norms by expressing the aspects of their own nature that they've had to suppress as part of a socially acceptable persona. Freud originally asserted that polymorphous perversion included sadomasochism. He suggested that each of us must contend with the pleasure of being cruel and destructive, sometimes toward others and sometimes toward ourselves. Sadomasochism is embedded into the collective shadow of our culture. The impulses that provide the inspiration for BDSM are shared by all of us, whether or not we identify as a kinkster. BDSM esteems the shadow of the collective. A submissive like the one that's pictured here, concealed in a hooded, full-body black latex suit, is among the most iconic images from the world of BDSM. All distinguishing characteristics that make up a personal identity have been erased. The person of the submissive, transformed into a property object belonging to the dom, is the shadow's response to Western culture's privileging of self-reliance, personal responsibility, independence, individuality, and ability. In the vision seminars, Jung mentioned the ancient Greek image of the synopados, the one that comes with me and is behind me. One could not hope to find a better embodiment of the synopados than the modern-day skin-tight silhouette of the submissive, following behind on the leash of their master or mistress, or chained up in the dungeon like an undiscovered self, a human shadow both connected and concealed. The recognition of sexuality as a bridge between biological instincts and psychological symbol formation has remained a part of Jung's legacy that subsequent generations of analysts have done little to develop. Back in 1960, James Hillman noted, Jung saw that instinct has an imaginal aspect, a mythic factor, and that therefore the sexual is also an activity of the imagination, a psychological expression. The sexual is a way the soul speaks. When the soul speaks, it is the logos of psyche that comes forth to create psychology. The world of BDSM provides the soul with the opportunity to speak freely in its twisted, erotic richness. And Jung's psychology provides a framework and a vocabulary to articulate the value found there. The value in question concerns the vitality and meaning that comes from living as a whole person. The psychoid is the concept that lies behind Jung's insight that sexuality partakes of both the biological instincts of the body and the symbol formation of the mind. Psychoid is a term that describes a process that is neither purely physical nor purely mental, but somehow includes elements of both. Some of you familiar with Rilke's beautiful poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo, might recall how the poet captures the essence of the psychoid as it appears in a work of art. A statue is just a piece of rough-hewn stone, until the mind recognizes it as something more than a chiseled piece of rock. We see skin, muscles, tendons, body, beauty. Something luminous and divine shines from inside the stone, and it sees us just as we see it. That weird moment of recognition combines the physical and the symbolic in a unified experience. Jung referred to archetypes as a psychoid factor, meaning that they exert an effect on both the body and the mind. In BDSM and kink, as in sexuality in general, physical sensations take on psychological meaning. It is not simply the sensation of kissing a boot that can be arousing. It is the psychological experience of kissing the master's boot and feeling the emotions that accompany lowering oneself and submitting to the symbolic authority of a powerful other. It is not necessarily impact in and of itself that is pleasurable in the dungeon. It is the psychoid experience of impact play that engages the meaning-making function of the psyche to symbolically interpret sensations in various ways. Impact can become a living symbol of endurance, submission, punishment, initiation, liberation. Well, you get the idea. The transformative experiences of BDSM and kink occur in the liminal space between the physical sensations of the body and the symbol formation of the psyche. The psychoid aspect of the archetype is what holds physical sensations and symbolic meaning together as a unified experience. And it explains why BDSM and kink are so potent and intensely pleasurable on both physical and psycho-emotional levels. The archetypal nature of BDSM experiences also creates the opportunity for psychological growth and transformation. As already noted, archetypal experience through BDSM and kink can promote the individuation process. With Hillman's archetypal psychology, the locus of attention shifts from a central concern with the person and the personal to the primacy of the image. Hillman built upon Jung's assertion that the psyche is fundamentally a series of images, an imaginal reality. He wrote, "Following Jung, I use the word fantasy image in the poetic sense, considering images to be the basic givens of psychic life, self-originating, inventive, spontaneous, complete, and organized in archetypal patterns. Fantasy images are both the raw materials and finished products of psyche, and they are the privileged mode of access to knowledge of soul. Nothing is more primary. Every notion in our minds, each perception of the world and sensation in ourselves must go through a psychic organization in order to happen at all. Every single feeling or observation occurs as a psychic event by first forming a fantasy image." End of quotation. Hillman contended that fantasy images precede and shape what we call reality. Fantasy first, then reality. Archetypal psychology yields fresh insights into the ways the soul is present in BDSM's activities and relationships. Hillman privileged the life of our aesthetic responses as the conveyance for bringing soul into the world. He referenced the original Greek word aesthesis, which means to gasp. The aesthetic response is sometimes a gasp of pleasure and sometimes one of shock at the surprise of discovering something weirdly beautiful. I propose that BDSM and kink are vigorously engaged with aesthetic responses and therefore can be regarded as modern forms of soul-making. To think of alternative sexualities in this way requires a deliteralized understanding of what practitioners are enacting. By shifting away from the personal and by focusing with a metaphorical frame of mind on the fantasy images that inspire the activities and relational dynamics, we can recognize BDSM and kink as transgressive necessities of the soul. Hillman focused on the soul as the true subject of psychology. He argued that the study of the soul was psychology's unique task. How do we learn about the soul and how it behaves? In his landmark work, Revisioning Psychology, Hillman conceived of 4 central themes that describe the activities of the soul: personifying, psychologizing, pathologizing, and dehumanizing. All 4 lead to relevant insights regarding BDSM and kink, but for today, I want to focus here on the concept of pathologizing. Hillman coined this challenging term to describe one of the primary ways the soul expresses itself: through fantasy images of breakdown, through suffering, and through disease, disorder, and decay. Fantasy images can appear through the imagination, through our dreams and visions, through works of art, and also through physical facts and difficult ordeals that we normally think of as personal challenges. Pathologizing is one of the soul's favorite modes of expression. What Hillman is suggesting is not about one person labeling another person as sick. It is not about judging someone or something as pathological. Pathologizing is about how the soul makes us aware of psychological reality. It is useful for understanding and affirming BDSM's fondness for transgression and taboo, for degradation and disgust, and for the monstrous and the macabre. All these privileged features of kink and BDSM are consistent with the soul's preferred mode of expression through what is broken, painful, and decadent. Hillman recognized that pathologizing is intimately connected to our sense of individuality. He suggested that we fear being truly ourselves because we fear the psychopathological aspect of who we really are. Each of us is peculiar, and we must contend with our unique disappointments and failures. Destruction seeps out of us autonomously, Hillman wrote. And in some cases, we are unable to reassemble our broken lives. The contemporary pursuits of BDSM provide a bridge between the problematic aspects of our individuality and the necessity of the soul to tell its own tales of pathos, cruelty, ugliness, and destruction through us. Let's consider edge play as an example of the soul's fondness for pathologizing. When we play on the edge, we are playing with the risk of going too far. And pathologizing is all about going too far. Pain can surpass the limits of pleasure and endurance. Fire can burn too hot. A knife's incision can cut too deeply. Oops, skin breaks, blood flows. The soul emerges through breakdown, transgression, and suffering. Play partners may have negotiated safe limits and obtained enthusiastic consent, but the soul recognizes the scene as a mythic enactment of transgression, human frailty, surrender, torture, suffering, and ego death. Such is the archetypal experience that occurs through the activities and relationships of BDSM, lending them a numinous power and intensity that is uncommon in tamer daytime pursuits. In fact, the world of BDSM is one of the few places in modern life where the soul's pathologized images can enter, deliteralized into human consciousness, while retaining their potency as expressions of imaginal reality. Distorted images are held within the sexual imagination, just as they are held in the designated play space, where they have a chance to develop subliminal richness and invisible depth. Pathologizing also directs our attention to the soul's intimate relationship with death, which is a recurring fantasy element in kink and BDSM. To be clear, I'm not speaking here about the physical reality of biological death. I'm speaking about death as a symbolic fantasy image. Ultimately, edge play is enacting our fascination with the unknown, what lies beyond our control. And surely death is the ultimate expression of the unknown, the ultimate destiny none of us can control. The soul image of death is among the psyche's most important sources of symbolic expression. When we recognize the archetypal value of death to the soul, the connection underlying the Gothic genre and its relationship to both BDSM and depth psychology becomes more understandable. The Gothic idiom blends desire and danger, the erotic and the abject, and it valorizes the tempering of innocence through inevitable encounters with the monstrous and the macabre. It's not a coincidence that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Dracula were all published in the same decade as Freud's first major work, Studies on Hysteria. With psychoanalysis, the Gothic monster of the Victorian era moved from being an external menace to dwelling inside each of us, an inner monster that threatens to overtake our more civilized and virtuous pretensions. From a depth psychological perspective, it's also not a coincidence that 50 Shades of Grey originated as a work of fan fiction based on the Twilight vampire series, a modernized revision of the Gothic for young adult readers. The pathologized tendencies of the soul and its special relation with death run through the Gothic genre, and they inform both the insights of depth psychology and the transgressive pleasures of BDSM. So I'm going to pause here and allow us our first breakout discussion. The question that I would like you to consider in the breakout rooms is, how do you see transgressive acts potentially contributing to the psychological growth of the individual? We're going to take about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms, and then we'll have another 10 minutes of discussion in the large group to see what comes up.
Perfect. And maybe before I send you to the breakout groups, it would be good if you want to write down the question or take a picture so you can have it, because this screen won't be accessible once you leave. Christoph and Mark, you should have received, there should have appeared a message for you to join a certain group. So you just have to click on join breakout room.
Okay.
Did it work, Christoph?
Oh, sorry, I'm out for the moment.
Okay, and Douglas, let me know, do you want to join one of the groups?
No, I think I'd like to let them have the chance. Do you want to pause recording though? Or I can.
I'll do.
All right. So in this book, The Deep Psychology of BDSM and Kink, I apply the psychologies of Jung and Hillman to 5 central themes that appear in the world of radical sexuality. The importance of play, suffering and degradation, the specter of evil, ecstasy, and the subliminal fascination with death. The book develops the thesis that soul is intimately involved in the intense experiences people seek out through these activities and relationships. Anyone hoping to understand and affirm the psychological value of BDSM and kink is going to have to contend with the prominent themes of suffering and degradation that are central to many of its activities. For mental health professionals, it can be particularly challenging to remain psychologically curious when confronted with patients who esteem harsh ordeals and physical and emotional pain. However, an archetypal approach to the topic reminds us how central both suffering and degradation are to the reality of the human condition. And it also reminds us that they are potentially psychologically valuable. In the book, I wrote, "The devastating consequences of suffering and degradation in the world are serious, and they need to be acknowledged. People suffer horrible ordeals in life every day. The ravages of disease, violence, injustice, systemic racism, sexism, poverty, crime, warfare, and death devastate individuals, families, and communities. And there is little that is noble, generative, or beneficent in the broken lives that are either pieced together or extinguished under such extreme circumstances. The reality of degradation occurs in the world with its own corrosive effect as well. Individuals are stripped of livelihood, status, dignity, life necessities, and worth through prejudice, oppression, abuse, and stigma. In some parts of the world, rigorously enforced caste systems lead to atrocities enacted by the privileged against the outcasts, who sometimes are designated as subhuman. The long, troubling history of literal, non-consensual slavery casts a shadow that cannot be ignored by any thoughtful discussion of contemporary consensual master-slave relationships. There is a statute in the United Kingdom that specifically defines sexual behaviors as acceptable only on the basis that sexual desire is recognizably pleasurable and appears civilized enough that it will not cause, condone, or promote suffering. The attempt to legislate acceptable sexual behavior by driving a wedge between suffering and pleasure indicates the difficult cultural position in which practitioners of BDSM find themselves. There are, of course, notable exceptions to the prevailing Western attitude towards suffering and degradation. In specific settings, they are consciously enlisted to facilitate growth through adversity, social cohesion, group identity, and spiritual transcendence. Examples include athletic training and competition, initiation rituals such as fraternity and sorority hazings, some religious rituals across multiple theologies, such as the Lakota sun dance or the Hindu Kavandi ceremony, and let us not forget military training, which incidentally is the source for many elements of gay leather culture. It is important to acknowledge that suffering and pain are not the same thing. Suffering involves undergoing and enduring a difficult ordeal, sometimes to the point of death, whereas pain refers to the nervous system's response to noxious stimuli. Physician Eric J. Cassell wrote about this distinction from a medical perspective in his excellent treatise on suffering. Suffering occurs when an impending destruction of the person is perceived. It continues until the threat of disintegration has passed or until the integrity of the person can be restored in some other manner. It follows then that although it often occurs in the presence of acute pain, shortness of breath, or other bodily symptoms, suffering extends beyond the physical. Most generally, suffering can be defined as the state of severe distress associated with events that threaten the intactness of the person. In an insight that may be familiar to practitioners of BDSM, Cassell found that bodily pain resulted in suffering under certain conditions. Namely, when people feel out of control, when the pain is overwhelming, when the source of the pain is unknown, when the meaning of the pain is dire, or when the pain is apparently without end. This distinction between pain and suffering that hinges on overwhelm, the unknown, and the meaning of an experience illustrates once again the psychoid nature of archetypal reality. When pain is perceived as an existential threat to one's personhood, then the archetype of suffering follows. The topic of suffering has been of particular interest to authors in the field of medicine and theology. Not surprisingly, BDSM practitioners recognize the potential to eroticize suffering in scenes that involve some version of the sadistic doctor or the reprobate cleric. The book includes a description of a medical role play by a 27-year-old Canadian kinkster named Moth Meadows, who uses the pronouns they and them. Moth had been hit by a car several years ago, and the ensuing emergency medical treatment was especially traumatic for them. After their initial recovery, they began to explore the possibility of creating a BDSM medical role play with their partner to gain a sense of mastery over the loss of autonomy they experienced during their medical treatment. They decided on the enactment of a surgical lobotomy as the theme for the role play, and I'm going to read some excerpts from their description. I wanted to be bound to something in some way, and I don't have a bed frame. So we just tied my arms to a broom handle because, you know, kinky people are inventive with kink. And I actually got to wear one of my medical robes that I'd taken from a hospital at one point. It was really fun. We actually found a sound clip of a heart monitor on YouTube and just played that, which was a great way to create a little bit of ambience. One of my limits for the scene was I didn't want to be left bound and alone for too long at any point, because I thought that could be pretty triggering. So we made sure that as a safety thing, I was never going to be left alone in the room for longer than a few seconds. So I was acting very confused and scared, and my partner was alternating between doing a condescendingly nice nurse voice and talking to me the way that nurses will kind of sometimes talk to you, where they're being nice, but you can tell they're a little bit annoyed with you, and they just sort of want to get through whatever they're doing. And when I wouldn't be compliant, my partner would switch to being really stern and mean with me and punishing me. Because I really wanted to explore that power imbalance where medical professionals can be nice to you, but at the end of the day, they're just going to get the thing they need to be done. And then once the lobotomy procedure was done, I role-played acting incredibly docile and confused and complacent. And then we played in that for a little bit and had sex, and I got untied, and we did more of like a submissive scene with me, but where I have now had my mind changed, which was fun. And I've never really explored approaching things like mind control through a medical context. And that was a really fun way of doing it. And the scene basically ended the way we always do our scenes, where we cuddle a lot. And once it's done, we'd go into like very strict aftercare mode and do a lot of cuddling and affirmations and touching and things like that. I was extremely turned on through the entire thing. Generally, when we do a scene that involves this much prep and discussion, we kind of set a point where we're going to start actually having sex. But often that point could take an hour into the scene. But we're both very, very into what's going on before that point. And it's the most elaborate foreplay ever. We could basically do an entire scene without any sexual touching, and it would be intensely sexual for both of us. End of description. Moth's description illustrates how much imagination and creativity go into creating an erotic role play. The importance of negotiating specific limits to avoid re-traumatization is also noteworthy, as is the attention given to aftercare to facilitate a clear and gentle transition back out of the dominant submissive headspace and into ego consciousness. Suffering and degradation are both primary elements in Moth's role play, as the medical procedure enacts an existential threat to their personhood and robs them of their autonomy. The specter of evil is another topic that is particularly important for anyone hoping to understand the deeper meaning and significance of BDSM and kink. I concur with the cautionary tone expressed by moral philosopher Elizabeth Minich. The recreational enactment of evil can have an invigorating and pleasurable effect that compensates for the monotony of ordinary life. But there is a risk that the play element in such situations can devolve into a complicit acceptance of evil as banal. Human consciousness negotiates an edge between psychic reality and literal reality. Playing with the spectral image of evil is not the same thing as perpetrating evil acts. The book considers evil as an archetypal soul image, as a particularly potent archetypal pattern characterized by malice, ruthlessness, intentional cruelty, and moral horror, giving expression to the unthinkable and unspeakable in their most destructive aspects. By defining evil in this way, the book emphasizes its imaginal aspect rather than addressing it as a human behavioral problem. And I ask, is there a way to balance risk and caution in engaging such potent psychic energy? The world of kink and BDSM is fascinated with evil. The visceral thrill of exploring the unthinkable and the unspeakable is almost emblematic of kink. Like devotees of slasher movies or neighbors who turn their suburban home into a blood-soaked haunted mansion for Halloween, we all recognize that there is something in us that wants to scare and be scared. A gasp of simultaneous terror and delight is a cherished moment in the modern BDSM dungeon. Psychoanalyst Avgi Sakatopoulou believed that we are born with an innate impulse to venture into the realm of the unthinkable and the unsayable to experience a psychological state that she called overwhelm. Such encounters with the darkness of the unconscious can break down the ego and allow a freshly integrated self-image to emerge. Overwhelm is related to what Minich described as a bit of sizzling hellfire that dwells within our recreational fantasy enactments of evil. For Jung, the topic of evil was a constant preoccupation that would not leave him alone. Jung saw enough devastation in his lifetime to recognize evil as a real and potent force in human affairs. Having witnessed the devastation of 2 world wars, the atrocities of the Holocaust, and the detonation of 2 atomic bombs, Jung regarded evil as an urgent psychological concern. However, the meta-concept of wholeness was the greater overarching principle guiding his psychology. Jung encountered an unusual problem, reconciling the psychological question of good and evil with his concept of the self. If one embraces good and rejects evil following the established moral injunctions of Western thought, how can one achieve psychological wholeness? His efforts to sort out the paradox led to several fundamental conclusions about the nature of evil, which together form the basis of a Jungian perspective. They include the following features. First, evil is a category of human thought, a subjective judgment reached through the operations of the conscious moral mind. Through the work of differentiation, we recognize that our inner world is comprised of disparate psychic elements. As we mature and attain higher levels of consciousness, we develop the discernment to judge some of these elements as evil. They are evil by virtue of our subjective moral perception. Second, evil is best understood in a historical context. Our subjective moral judgment is contextualized by the historical traditions that shaped our values and beliefs. Psychologically speaking, we are the products of our history. The conclusion that an idea or an impulse is evil always bears the traces of a historical perspective. Third, the human shadow is the great danger. It is our disavowal of our own capacity for evil that leads to projections and the justification to perpetrate evil acts. As we learn what others around us view as good or evil, we learn to suppress what they might recognize as evil within ourselves. By not allowing these unacceptable elements to come into consciousness, they easily become shadow projections that we cast onto others whom we then perceive as evil. Such projections form the justification for fighting and annihilating the evil other. Because psychic material that is repressed into the shadow always has a strong archetypal character, evil has a strong capacity to attract and to fascinate. Fourth, the psychological task is to work out the problem of evil on the personal level, because individual change begets social change. Jung was not optimistic about the prospects of a collective solution to the problem of evil. He believed that the work of confronting one's own personal shadow and reclaiming the projected parts of our own soul would lead to a collective comprised of more psychologically conscious individuals. We're still working on that project. Fifth, when we consider evil as a part of our own nature, we encounter our fate and our guilt, which are essential for integrating the shadow. The great task of individuation is to come to terms with the ways in which we differ from the society around us. All of us are weird, to reclaim a term that has recently been politicized. Each of us a unique expression of soul. The experience of our peculiarity can involve feelings of guilt for not conforming to collective norms, but that same nonconformity designates the fate that is uniquely ours to carry in life. Often, our uniqueness includes aspects that the ego views as evil. The challenge of individuation is to accept those aspects hidden in the shadow and ethically integrate them as part of our identity. And sixth, wholeness comes through introspection, reflection, inner struggle, soul work, and a personal system of morality and ethics, which must be constantly tested and revised. Accepting and integrating the evil that is uniquely ours is no easy task. It requires a serious and often painful struggle between contradictory elements within our own soul. A more mature consciousness recognizes the necessity of introspection and reflection to identify the disparate contradictory elements of our own nature and to take personal responsibility for those aspects we deem to be evil. The insights we gain through inner work form the foundations of a more sophisticated personal system of morality and ethics. Because the individuation process is never complete, it is incumbent upon us to continually interrogate and refine the values and beliefs that help us determine what is evil. So, what do these conclusions have to do with kink and BDSM? It is probably best to address BDSM enthusiasts directly in answering that question. So here is a proposed set of kinky axioms inspired by Jung's approach to evil. First, evil is real and you need to take it seriously. But it is up to you to reach your own conclusions about how and where it is present in your BDSM play and in your life. You must use your subjective judgment and develop your own system of morals and ethics to guide your choices. Second, history is kinky and evil runs through it. The specter of evil is with you in your creative play when you draw upon the images of history to build your fantasy scenarios and BDSM style. The dungeon, the torture chamber, the instruments of pain and suffering all carry with them their own histories, which include the literal degradation and torment of people who were harmed and destroyed without their consent or negotiation. The presence of the past is part of what makes BDSM exciting and sometimes overwhelming. Your play will deepen when you contemplate the presence of evil that lives in the historical artifacts of the scene. The historical will draw you into the archetypal. Third, know your shadow. Your personal shadow may confront you with the pleasure you feel in your sadism or your masochism as something within you that is real and vital. But the shadow is exciting and fascinating because part of its potent allure comes from the evil that also resides there. Sometimes the scene comes close to the edge of what either you or your partner can control. And when one of you loses control, when consent evaporates and safe words are ignored, then evil has jumped from the imaginal to the literal. The negotiation of hurt becomes the perpetration of harm, and the consequences can be disastrous. Fourth, your kink will make you whole. If you can recognize the presence of evil as a soul image without falling into an archetypal possession, you can integrate aspects of your inner world into consciousness and achieve a greater level of psychological wholeness that will serve you in life. Your upbringing may have taught you to reject and discard certain aspects of who you are on a deeper level. Your kink restores those lost parts and can lead to a richer imagination and fuller range of emotions. Fifth, your kink will reveal your guilt and your fate. Others often cannot understand why BDSM brings you so much pleasure. Your desires express your subjective truth. And when you can recognize a flicker of evil in them, that is, the impulse to harm and destroy or to be destroyed with horrific malicious intent, you will discover that you are living your fate. Owning the evil that is uniquely yours also involves feeling the guilt that makes you unique. Guilt becomes a catalyst for developing your personal morality and ethics. At such a moment, play becomes craft, and BDSM becomes a path of personal development. And sixth, if you want the most out of your kink, treat it as psychological work. Your scenes require introspection, reflection, and ethical appraisals. These practices help you identify and evaluate when evil has appeared in your play, sometimes invited and sometimes unbidden. Reflecting on what has happened develops self-knowledge. You increase sensitivity and attunement toward your inner life and that of your partner, and the psychological benefits will carry over into other areas. And we conclude this section with a question. What about Hitler and the Nazis? Any exploration of evil, sooner or later, will lead you back to Germany and World War II. Hitler and the Nazis are perhaps the unrivaled image of evil in the contemporary Western imagination. Jung referred to them throughout his writing, as does almost every author featured in the present discussion. Kink and BDSM commentator Peter Tupper wrote, "Nazis came to have a symbolic function as a floating signifier for the abject in simplistic narratives of good and evil," unquote. The connection between the BDSM aesthetic and the Nazis is close indeed. The iconic look of gay leather motorcycle culture immortalized by Tom of Finland was appropriated from the Nazi uniforms designed by Hugo Boss. Many of the founding members of the gay leather motorcycle clubs were returning World War II veterans, and some had been prisoners of war. It is reasonable to speculate that the specter of Nazi evil was a looming shadow, ripe for eroticization in the psyches of early BDSM practitioners. So now we are going to have our second breakout session for today. Again, 10 minutes in small group and another 10. Gemma, can we start? Thank you. Start recording again. And let's see if I can pull this up. So just a final thought here. Much of what we've discussed today involves the archetypal element of the theatrical. Let's consider the deep theatricality of BDSM. People meet to do a scene, which can involve roles and characters, costumes, masks, lighting, and props. As in all theater, the psychoid element is present, as the scene is both real and unreal. Real as a human encounter of deep emotion and intimacy, and unreal as play in the imaginal sense. Again, Avgi Sakatopoulou has written extensively about Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play, which is a work that places its characters and the audience in the liminal space between intergenerational racial trauma and the erotic imagination. The theatrical pedigree of BDSM includes the Marquis de Sade, who famously staged plays with his fellow inmates at the Charenton Asylum, and he was once described as shouting out directions during his debaucheries like an apostate theater director. In Venus in Furs, the protagonist struggles with his femme fatale to negotiate the dividing line between what is real and what is play in their obsessive relationship of domination and submission. And long before Zakir Masak and Sade, the most extreme ordeal rituals of the classical world at Eleusis were under the aegis of Dionysus, the god of madness ecstasy, and theater. So, to conclude, the work of Jungian psychology writ large is ideally suited to support a new era of psychological curiosity and understanding about BDSM and kink. Jung's work encourages an approach that is expansive, collaborative, interdisciplinary, and non-pathologizing. I believe it has something of value to offer the BDSM community because it is also soul-centered. It affirms the value of the transgressive and the weird, and it emphasizes psychological work that fosters growth, meaning, and intimacy in our peculiar lives. BDSM and kink also have something of value to offer Jungian archetypal psychology by showing our modern hyper-rational, hyper-materialistic, hyper-literalized world that there are still ways to encounter the complete otherness of the soul. Through highly evolved, negotiated consensual practices, radical sexualities have developed a safe container to allow the transgressive necessities of the soul to express themselves and still retain their power to disrupt and transform. Thank you very much. Stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Douglas, for the presentation. And we have only 5 minutes left, but maybe if there were any concluding thoughts that someone would like to share before we end.
Something that was brought up in the second subgrouping, not by me, but someone else pointed it out and something that the risks you'd have in a therapeutic context, if you had, when dealing with a kink client, you'd have to be even more careful about transference and countertransference than in other discussions.
That is a great point. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, interacting with the client would involve necessarily you having your own fantasy about their fantasy or about them enacting it or not enacting it. And so the risks of me acting in ways that are for the benefit of my own erotic sides rather than for theirs would be very high.
Yeah. I think it's also one of those things, like you're saying, it's risky on the part of the client to come into therapy and share it, right? And I think that just having an appreciation for what that person is going through, wondering, am I going to be judged now? Am I going to be pathologized? Is my therapist going to tell me not to do this? Is there going to be a transference towards me as an authority figure in the role of therapist so that they're looking for me either to approve or disapprove versus, I think is always the Jungian way. Let's sit down and figure out what's really going on here on a deeper level, and what's a deeper meaning about what is happening. And like you're saying, in terms of the transference and the countertransference, right? So I think that's true, that we need to be cautious. On the one hand, gangbusters, go for it, have a great time. Or on the other hand, boy, I have some really serious concerns about this. Either of those could be potentially problematic. It's complicated, isn't it? Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you very much, Douglas. I'm really struck with the depth of what you're saying, contrasting that with my previous thoughts around this area as something incredibly superficial. And that's just fascinating, I think.
Oh, thank you,
Very
Brian.
touched.
That means a lot. You know, I gave a version of this talk in San Francisco and at the Jung Institute. And one of the questions that came up was, do you really think practitioners are thinking about all this? And I said, no, that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Because there's so much opportunity here for a psychological richness and an exploration of the deep psyche that where else do people find this?
Yeah.
Do you think that it develops greater spirituality amongst people who practice this? And in what way?
What a great question. Yes, I do. I think that there is certainly the potential for that. And I think that you can see the ways in which a lot of these practices are adjacent to spiritual and ecstatic practices in other cultures. Like I referenced the Lakota sun dance, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they actually pierce the flesh just above the sternum and then tie a leather rope to a symbolic tree, and there's dancing around the tree until the strap breaks. So it's a very extreme ordeal. It's called the ordeal path. And if you look at the history of shamanism, a lot of the shamanic practices that Mircea Eliade documented in his book, I think it's called Paths to Ecstasy. I think that's what the name of it is. Practices of Ecstasy. A lot of them deal with these very extreme physical situations where there is a symbolic ritual, death, descent to the underworld, dismemberment. The body parts of the shaman are thrown into a cauldron, and there's communication with the ancestors as underworld spirits. So you can see in terms of the imagery that we're in a very similar realm to the fantasy images of BDSM and kink. And so there's a very spiritual component to it that can be moved into the foreground.
Well, we are at our time. I want to thank everyone for being here on a Sunday, especially, and Douglas for sharing this presentation with us. It has been very enriching. I hope everyone has a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you both.
Thank you.